So to
Yep.
start this, so let me start here. I'm lucky enough to have Jonathan Simon up to discuss the 22 election and issues kind of regarding that. Jonathan, can you kind of tell people like how you're an expert on the subject?
Well, I've been following election data patterns for just about 20 years, really since Bush v. Gore, so a little more than 20 years, and with an eye towards anomalies and disparities and trying to look for baselines because the elections became computerized, almost fully computerized, and there was really inadequate security, inadequate audit processes. So many opportunities for manipulation of election results, in addition to all the voter suppression stuff that was going on. And so I sort of became an analyst and a chronicler of that. I wrote a book, Code Red, Computerized Elections and the War on American Democracy. I headed up Election Defense Alliance from 2006 to 2016, and we were advocating for a public observable vote counting process, such as they have in many now European democracies and even elsewhere, New Zealand and other places. So, I've been very much wrapped up with this, watching, the elections very carefully, and trying to glean what we could about whether the counting process was honest and accurate, and often coming up with very disturbing data patterns that suggested that it was not.
Yeah, well, I've read your book, Code Red, which is excellent, and I recommend it to everybody. It's on Amazon, and I share your concerns, and that's why I want to talk about 2022. I guess my first question is kind of tied to that is that mail-in voting does seem to is observable and countable, and do you think that's why Republicans hate it so much?
Wow. I'm not sure. I mean, I think they probably hate it. So, I mean, virtually everything is seen through a partisan lens, of course. So, they certainly could hate it so much because they were of the opinion that it facilitated the vote of the working people, younger people, voters of color, et cetera. In other words, more of the Democratic constituency. They've lately sort of seemed to be getting religion in the sense of realizing that a lot of seniors and a lot of right-wing voters, Republican voters, also vote by mail. And in advising them not to vote by mail, they were making a mistake. They were actually, reducing their own turnout, their own voters' turnout. So there is that element. There is also, some grounds for suspicion that, as you said, with vote by mail, you actually have hand-marked paper ballots of necessity. They are recountable. They're more easily auditable. They're counted by optical scanners as opposed to touchscreen voting machines or created by ballot marking devices. There's less computerization involved, and they can always be, assuming chain of custody is maintained, they can always be recounted. So, there is some sense that in places, for instance, Georgia is one, voters were being pushed to go to the polls and vote on ballot marking devices where the computer creates a barcode of your vote, much more problematic to audit or verify. So that may also have been an element as to why the Republicans, Donald Trump, and the Republicans in general have sort of been on a jihad against mail-in voting. The ostensible reason is that, there's more opportunity for fraud, but until they actually present some evidence of voter fraud, we can, I think, pretty much rest easy that it is a virtually non-existent security problem.
I think that's what they call in statistics overly determined, right? There's so many factors why Republicans would be against mail-in voting. There's like, one, it's countable. Two, more minorities vote. It allows more people to vote. Period. All, they're against greater voter turnout. They're against minorities voting, and they seem to not like voting that you can count. So,
Yeah, and I'll,
um,
I'll add to that. I'll add to that, that when you force voters to at-poll voting, and especially when you do it with ballot marking devices, um, the bugaboo with ballot marking devices is that unlike with hand-marked paper ballots where 50 voters can come in, be handed a ballot, go to a little cubicle or booth, and all be filling them out at the same time, with ballot marking devices, you might have 2, 3 computers for a whole precinct, and everybody has to wait online for each voter. And if there are any problems or breakdowns or issues that the voter raises, the line gets longer and longer and longer. So we've seen lines literally a mile long in places like Cobb County, Georgia, places with these ballot marking devices. So if you can drive voters to election day voting at the polls, and if you can underservice the counties or precincts where there are voters that you do not want to see cast a vote, you stand a pretty good chance of driving some of those voters away. They're working people. They have their caretaking responsibilities. They're not wealthy. They can't hire somebody to do those jobs for them. Typical members of the Democratic constituency, and they can't wait online for 6 hours. So they might wait for 2 hours and then leave. When you also ban the distribution of food and water, it becomes more obvious, what the game is, what you're up to, and it's basically voter suppression.
absolutely. I was curious, do you know, I know that there have been these laws banning water, and I was wondering how they would survive a constitutional challenge. Do you know if anybody did distribute water and was arrested? If there has been any challenges to those laws?
I don't know what actually happened on the ground with them. I mean, famously, the first of those laws, and I think the most prominent was passed in Georgia. The interesting thing about some of these voter suppression schemes is that there's a kind of growing, I wouldn't say it's a consensus yet, but there is opinion out there based on statistics from the 2020 and 2022 elections, that a lot of these things don't really work. That you put in these, difficult restrictive voter ID laws, you put in shortening of hours, reduction of polling places. I mean, things that are really intended, and not to mention disinformation about when election day is and how you can vote, and whether, think of Ron DeSantis with his election Gestapo, very publicly shackling, I think it was 15 voters of color for supposedly illegally voting. So when you trot out all this stuff that is sort of reminiscent of Jim Crow and worse, in places like the South where there's been experience of this within living memory. One of the things it does is if it's handled right from a PR standpoint by advocates of voting and voting rights, and in this case by the Democratic Party, is it makes a lot of people really mad. And it drives them to be more determined than ever to vote. So it's still not clear. I think my jury is out on whether these things in the aggregate work. And with elections, it's just a pure numbers game. That's all that it is. So if you can get 5% of the voters you don't want to vote, not to vote, in other words, get the voters you want to keep at home or prevent from casting a ballot, not to be part of the electorate. That's 5% of, in elections that we've seen are decided by 1% or less, you win. So, there's a tremendous incentive for these voter suppression schemes. And the question is not only whether they worked in 2020 and 2022, when they kind of got really ramped up by Republican legislatures, but whether they will work going forward. In other words, how long does that backlash to them, that anger, that God damn it, I'm going to vote no matter what, how long does that last? Is that sustainable? Or if they're playing a long game, do they count on the fact that eventually people will get tuckered out of waiting online for 6 hours or being threatened with arrest or any other form of intimidation?
I mean, I know that I probably wouldn't vote if I had to wait for 8 hours. So it would work on me.
Yeah, and I mean, and here's the thing, we're having a hard enough time getting participation rates up to the norm in democratic countries. I mean, obviously, a place like Australia, where voting is sort of quasi-mandatory, participation rates are up over 90%. But even countries like Germany and France and stuff, have higher participation rates than we do. So there's a tremendous apathy when it comes to voting, a tremendous sense among, I'd say, close to half the public, that I'm not going to bother, my vote won't count. I just have too many things on my plate. All the candidates are the same. There's no, there's many, many reasons. So, the motivation to vote in this country is one of the things that has been targeted by the corporations and generally by the right. And the smaller the electorate, generally, the better the Republicans do. And, that's been the norm up through the last couple of elections. The question is that changing at all? And are there, as I said, are there schemes to make the electorate smaller? Are they backfiring? But certainly, if you're going to, make somebody stand on line for 6 hours and you're going to say, nope, no, nobody can distribute food or distribute water, it's unquestionable that you're going to turn some of those voters away. They simply will not be able to or will not want to stand on line. And if you think about it, standing on line for, I don't know, even an hour, let's say to go to a movie or go to a sports event, that requires real fandom, real devotion, real motivation. And when you think about a single vote, it's very easy to tell yourself, well, what's one vote? Whoever won an election by one vote? And the answer is virtually nobody. And so it becomes very
those
easy
one votes
to
add up. And as you mentioned to me when we talked, we weren't recording, but about the House election, Lori Boebert, if I get her name right, won by like 500 votes. And yeah, that's not one person, but that's only 500 people who each thought their vote didn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's I suppose Immanuel Kant and the, categorical imperative, it's sort of like, well, if I do it, it's not going to matter. But if I'm just like everybody else and everybody else follows in my footsteps or does the same thing, then it sure as hell does matter. So that's what makes it, what makes voter suppression such a tempting game, because from the individual standpoint, it's really hard to convince the individual that if they don't wait on that line, or they don't go through whatever hoops they have to go through to register and vote, and verify their vote, if that's part of it, it's going to be a catastrophe. That's a really hard sell. And so you take all those individuals as individuals, and as you say, they're, if it's 20% of the voting constituency, that's way more than enough to change the results of elections. So, there are a lot of games being played, both to get the vote out. I mean, the appeals to vote, I know, and for that matter, to, fund, to send money to campaigns. I mean, I think we all know now. I mean, I was getting an email one day that Warnock was winning, and then the next day that he was losing, and the following day that he was winning, and then that he was losing, all with triple exclamation points. That drive to motivate voters and get them out when you have a country that is, and certainly certain states and districts that are so closely divided as ours is, that becomes the name of the game. Driving voters to the polls. I mean, sometimes literally driving them to the polls, prohibiting the driving of voters to the polls, and then figuratively motivating voters to go to the polls or to stay home, in many ways supersedes the normal politics of why you should vote for somebody. That, in the 2022 election, that became far less important than the idea that, why you should vote for a particular candidate. It really was another proxy election about Donald Trump and about MAGA and about the culture wars. And it becomes a question of motivating your base to get out there and cast a ballot. This is not a very good recipe for politics. Apart from concerns about the security of elections, this is just really not a great recipe for informed politics, and it's more of a recipe for ongoing red-blue divisions and very little cross dialogue, very little compromise.
Well, I'm going to tee you up for kind of a longer answer here. Just in broad strokes, what did you think of the 2022 election? I guess through two lenses. One, through sort of your specialty, the idea of this black box and non-public, and kind of seeing, was there messing with the votes in the computer side of things, and just generally between shenanigans, which I'll be voter suppression or gerrymandering, just whatever your thoughts on how legitimate the 2022 election is, not compared to like 1980s, but in the times of the post 2002. Was this one of our more legitimate elections or one of the less ones?
Well, probably one of the more legitimate, but I have to say it's very hard to tell. And one of the reasons it's hard to tell is that there was how should I put it? There was a tweaking of the polls, and this applies to the pre-election polling and almost certainly as well to the exit polling. I'm not quite 100% sure about that. But there was a recognition after the 2020 election, when, if you'll remember, for instance, there were 27 House races rated as toss-ups by the Cook Report, which is slightly to the right of center, but basically neutral, and the New York Times. And of those 27 toss-up races, the Republicans took all 27. There were other features of 2020 that also, raised major eyebrows far up the forehead. And so the pollsters in reviewing this came to the recognition that, we must be oversampling Democrats somehow, even though we keep trying to correct, even though we have the likely voter cutoff model, which already corrects for that or overcorrects for that. And it would go into deep weeds to explain the likely voter cutoff model, but I've written about it. It's in Code Red. It's in various other papers I've written about, and others have written about it as well. But basically, it tweaks the sample to the right, is the bottom line. And so they had already had that correction, but apparently it wasn't enough. And so they added an additional tweaking. And what was interesting about this was that it was pretty much out in the open. Philip Bump, who writes analytically for the Washington Post, talked about it quite frankly in one of his post-election articles, that basically they had tweaked the polls to the right. So in a sense, we really didn't have the kind of baseline we had in the past. And this is something that I've talked and written about all the way through this 20-year period, is that there is a feedback loop between the polls and the vote counts. And eventually pollsters, if they want to stay in business, have to get vote counts right. So there's a lot more pressure on pollsters to change their methodology than there is on the vote counters and the voting equipment vendors to change their game. And so in 2022, the polls were pretty accurate. I mean, they were off here and there in both directions. First time we've seen that. Previous to that, I have to emphasize, virtually every election, there's been a red shift, which is, polls that come out to the left of the vote counts, or vote counts that come out to the right of the polls pervasively, and especially concentrated in critical races, battleground states, and critical districts. So this was a departure from that pattern. We saw it going both ways, really not much of a net in either direction. This was new, and it either indicated that, well, the votes are being counted honestly, and the pollsters finally dealt with their mysterious errors and mistaken assumptions enough to get it right, or the votes are not being counted honestly, and the pollsters finally figured out how to match these not honestly counted votes. We really don't know. That's part of the problem with our election system, is it's very hard to get the hard evidence necessary to know. So
Let me see if I can. I want to see if I can sort of summarize that. So Republicans keep from 2002 on, from where we go to kind of primarily electronic voting, some of it without paper ballots. Republicans keep outperforming polls in their election results, so the pollsters keep baking in a kind of a right wing expectation of outperforming the polls. So the polls are more right, show better results to Republicans, and yet Republicans would then outperform even that, and finally they weigh the polls enough in favor of Republicans that they kind of are getting the results. The overperformance is baked in.
Yeah, I mean that's the broad brush of it. I mean there are some nuances and weave in all this that have to do with the 2012 election, which is a whole separate story, and the role of possible role of Anonymous and Karl Rove's Orca operation. That kind of the impact of that election was to make the pollsters think twice about all this right tweaking. But that was an election in which it was apparent that Anonymous at least took credit for intervening and crippling Rove's operation, which was billed as a get out the vote operation, but also had the capacity to manipulate vote counts. So, things were sort of more according to Hoyle in that election. The pollster said, oh, wow, we're overcorrecting. And then 2014 and 2016 came along and they said, whoa, wait a minute, things are back to the to the way they were, which is where, Republicans are outperforming our polls. We better start correcting again. So there've been a couple of sort of hitch steps in this whole process. But the bottom line is that, yes, as you said, the Republicans outperform the polling, and the pollsters assume that that's because there must be something wrong with their polls and they're oversampling Democrats, or Republicans are lying, or whatever. They don't really have a great theory of the case, but they decide, well, results are results. We've got to match the results. And so they tweaked their polls enough in 2022 that it looked pretty much normal and on the level, except in places like Florida, where there was still a huge red shift. There happened to be a big blue shift in New Hampshire. So it wasn't all one way, but there were places, and Florida really stands out because Ron DeSantis absolutely needed that landslide win, or close to a landslide win. So there was a lot of motivation there to stuff the ballot box one way or another electronically. And the polls, as tweaked as they were, didn't even come close in Florida. So there are still plenty of questions about 2022. I think the big takeaway from 2022 was that the election deniers did very badly. The candidates that Trump was supporting, and in some cases, handpicking, like Herschel Walker, to run, did very badly. And most of the ones that were running for office where they could, like Secretary of State, where they could control the election going into 2024, lost. And some of them lost badly, some of them lost very narrowly. But the overall story was they lost, they were repudiated. And that has some really interesting implications for 2024 that I'm in the process of writing about right now, and they're not all entirely straightforward.
Well, okay, so I want to kind of, I guess, two things came to mind, but let me talk about the sort of numbers. Have you looked at the correlation between, like, where there's a more red shift and less red shift, or even blue shift, how that relates to what percent there was mail-in voting with paper ballots versus purely electronic voting?
Not yet. I mean, that's one of the things that, eventually we get to. They only have two hands. I have a colleague who's working on those type of correlations. I mean, we also want to look at what we call cumulative vote share analysis is another indicator that we have. On the surface, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of correlation with voting equipment or type of or mode of voting. It gets a bit complex because a lot of really have 3,240 some odd election systems out there. Every county runs its own system. I mean, there are some states that are more uniform than others, and we can kind of look at those. My inclination at this point, I mean, given sort of limited bandwidth, limited resources, day jobs, and whatnot, is to try, I usually have a pretty good nose for where the hyena is hiding in the bush. And my plan is to look at Florida more closely, look at Ohio more closely. There are plenty of other places, to look. My sense is that overall, this was not an election that was greatly interfered with. I mean, there was certainly plenty of legislation on the books, making it either easier or more difficult to vote. We wrote for Who What Why, where I'm an editor. We created a democracy report card. We looked at all the states and their provisions, and how they handle things like voter registration and eligibilities and impediments that they put, in front of voters or facilitations. So, we had a pretty comprehensive study of that going into the election. And it's all over the lot in this country. I mean, it's mostly bad, and especially the red states. It was very clear that there was a huge red-blue division in terms of encouragement to vote, voting rights, the basic functioning of this, basic protocol of democracy. There was a big red-blue split. The red states, many of them failed and failed badly. So we do know that there are big problems out there, and how this country would be voting in the absence of all these issues and problems, is on the one hand, it's hard to calculate. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that there would be a significant leftward shift if we had a democracy that was, both more uniform and really more focused on participation rather than on this, bugaboo and really, false flag of voter fraud. The campaign against voter fraud, has been going on for years. Chris Kobach, was part of that. Trump's commission, to ferret out voter fraud. They found absolutely nothing, and nobody has ever found anything. Matter of fact, the only real voter fraud stories out there are a few, notable Republicans like Mark Meadows and that have been voting in two places or voting illegally or whatever. They really haven't, caught or detected any real evidence of voter fraud. And the thing is, the penalties against voter fraud, even in blue states, are pretty high. So, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't really expect, to get one vote more or 3 votes more or whatever to risk going to jail for 5 years is a pretty stupid bargain. I know Dinesh D'Souza, the convicted felon, pardoned, came out with the film 2000 Mules. I mean, about, the vote harvesting and all this mail-in ballot stuff. And I mean, that was just so thoroughly debunked. What they claimed to, be an analysis and what they claimed to present as evidence was truly pathetic. Not that it didn't get a lot of play and a lot of, especially the MAGA audience saying, see, there you go, there's your voter fraud. It just isn't there. I mean, there's been research, there's been studies, it's not there. And yet it forms the basis for this whole campaign of voting restriction.
Well, it doesn't form a basis. It's the justification. It's the
Yeah,
thin
yeah,
veneer
the
because
pretext.
they can't say voter suppression is our goal. I mean, they do behind closed doors. I mean, I don't even think it's not even closed doors anymore. They say it out loud. They go, if everybody voted, we lose.
That's right. I mean, I believe Donald Trump said that. I mean, you know, several prominent Republicans have kind of fessed to that. And not even if everybody voted, it's just even if, you know, even if a significant percentage more voted, you wouldn't even need everybody. It's, you know, it's part of the, I don't know, I guess it's part of the philosophy that was prevalent in the South. You know, if we can restrict the electorate to white landowners, we can run our quote unquote democracy. And you know, we've seemed to have outgrown that and left it behind. And yet there are some pretty damn powerful elements in this country with a lot of money and a lot of influence that are still trying to push us back to that place. And, you know, through their control of the Supreme Court, through Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society and, you know, all the money that's poured in there. You know, a billionaire recently gifted him over $1 billion to basically, you know, buy judgeships and advance that agenda. And through that control, I mean, we've already seen the Voting Rights Act be effectively gutted in most of its most key provisions. So it's not, you know, we're not out of the woods. And, you know, if I don't think the right has decided, and I'm talking about the far right, you know, has decided, okay, we lose, let's go find some other sandbox. You know, they keep regrouping, they keep coming back. They have the think tanks, they have the money, they have the infrastructure, and we're still in their sights. I mean, democracy is still a target. And so we really can't count on the fact that we had one election where a bunch of election deniers lost to say, oh, phew, you know, everything's good now. Now we can go relax. No way. This battle, you know, that was one battle. It was not Waterloo. It was not Stalingrad. It was a battle. And there are many more battles to be fought, and they are not going to stop.
Well, I think they accomplished what they needed to do. They took the House. There's going to be no more vote. There's no danger of any voting rights legislation passing. Not that the Biden administration pushed hard for it in the first place. They're like, we must stop this fascist takeover of our elections. We need to pass voting rights protection. I mean, later, you know, that'll be like one of the last things we try to do, and we'll kind of half-ass it. And I think that's why people don't think their vote matters, because they get Trump, a fascist, or they get Biden, who wants to be the fascist best friend. It's like,
yeah, although, you know, I'm less harsh than you, as you know, in that assessment. I do think that Sinema and Manchin were real obstacles, not just, you know, not just sort of paid actors. I mean, well, they're paid by corporations, but I mean, you know, they weren't. How should I put it? You know, there are some who believe that the Democrats were basically hiding behind Sinema and Manchin, and they didn't want to make these changes either. And that's probably true for some of them, but I would say not most of them. I think there was a genuine, earnest effort to pass the SAFE Act and various, you know, voting rights and genuine election integrity legislation. I think it ran up against the filibuster. The Republicans have been dead against it, which tells you pretty much all you need to know about them and their motivation. But it also ran into Manchin and Sinema. I don't know. You know, maybe the Democrats are as cynical as, you know, and as laissez-faire and negligent about all this as you would say, or others would say. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I'm not sure. But the bottom line is, you're right. I mean, going forward, forget it as far as federal legislation of any sort of positive note in the area of anything, but certainly in the area of voting rights and protecting the right to vote and protecting the count of the vote.
That's all the Republicans need to do. They took one branch of Congress. Nothing's going to pass. for another 2 years, which means people are going to get angrier. And who are they going to get angry at? They're going to get angry at the president for not making their lives better.
Okay, but here's the other thing about that. And I mean, you're right about that. On the other hand, it does appear, and we'll have to see how it shakes out when the rhetoric, gives way to actual behavior and action. It does appear that, they're going with the full bore, far right, MAGA, Marjorie Taylor Greene, flag. And that they are going to continue to propose things or to block things that are popular, propose things that are unpopular, and generally take a public that's already exhausted with these Trumpified, this Trump agenda, and just keep pushing it. Investigations of cabinet members, of Adam Schiff, of Hunter Biden's laptop. I mean, all this stuff that is, appears guaranteed to bring about electoral defeat for their candidates in 2024. They don't seem to have any hesitation about going forward with this. And for that, and this is where I think it gets, sort of interesting. For that, there's really only two explanations. One is that they're crazy. And two is that they believe that they can govern as badly as they want and actually hold on to power by one means or another. And the means that I'd be most afraid of at this point is actually rigging the election, not doing a January 6th after they lose an election, but rigging the election. And why is that? It's because by intent or by fortuitous accident, they have made the public absolutely allergic to any investigation of election results. We are so sick. I mean, the whole public is so, with the exception of some MAGAs, but basically everybody who's not a MAGA is absolutely, the anaphylactic shock when you suggest that an election may have been miscounted or stolen or whatever. Nobody wants to hear it. The media doesn't want to hear it. Democrats don't want to hear it. Election administrators don't want to hear it. What does that mean? That means that if you do have access and you do, have the will to power, and you're willing to use that access to achieve that will to power and rig the damn 2024 election, and you do it, what's the reaction going to be? And especially if the polls, which were tweaked in 2022 and were so successful, are similarly tweaked as you would expect they would be in 2024. So you're going to have very, very, very little forensic evidence. You're not going to have an accurate baseline. You're going to have tweaked polls, and you're going to have because they'd have to rig big to, push forward after what they plan to do over the next 2 years, I would say, you're going to have a pretty big rig, and it won't show up as nearly as big as it is. And whatever does show up, you're going to have a reaction that says, okay, but we're not challenging that. And that puts us again, and I know we always sound like Chicken Little when we say this stuff, but it does put us in a very hazardous position with the dynamics in play going into 2024.
Well, I don't think there has to be a big rig. They've set expectations. Republicans no longer plan on winning the popular election. So they think they lose by 4 million votes. That's a good outcome, because all they have to do is lose by 4 million votes and pull approximately 30,000 more votes across 4 states, and then their electoral college victory.
Yeah, and especially if the candidate is not Donald Trump and is less provocative and and whatnot, if it's a DeSantis or a Nikki Haley or whoever the hell, Glenn Youngkin or whoever it might be, yeah, it's entirely possible that they can get close enough that it could be a small rig. However, I just it doesn't make in any way conventional political sense for them to look at the results of the 2022 election, with the exception of Kari Lake, everybody kind of, more or less everybody important conceded. but it were just, yes,
No,
they
no,
got,
I understand your point. I'm just saying that the expectation is not. I think the Republicans have given up the expectation that the popular vote's in play. Their
oh, yeah,
goal
yeah.
is that in two elections, the win in 2016 and the loss in 2020, whatever quotation marks you might on either, it still is Donald Trump lost by at least 3 million in both elections in the popular vote, one by 3, one by 6, or whatever. But but the actual loss was about 50,000 votes across 4 states
Right,
both times.
as was his win in 2016, and that's the thing, and that's the other thing about the 2022 election. The punditry, talked about, a huge setback for the Republicans in terms of all these Trump endorsed candidates who lost, and it certainly was a significant setback for Donald Trump. But you've got to look at so many of those races were very close. And that tells you that there are millions and millions and millions of people out there who still buy into the myth that the 2020 or the lie that the 2020 election was stolen, that are still, willing to listen to the extremist and salute the extremist rhetoric of a Boebert, or she's moderated slightly with her very close call, but a Marjorie Taylor Greene, and some of the, obviously a DeSantis or an Abbott or whatever, they're willing to, go with that. And there are a lot of them out there, as shocking as that may seem. These elections were, with only a couple of exceptions, these elections were very close, and a lot of election denier House members were elected. I mean, obviously, these are safe Republican seats. There are many, many safe Republican House seats out there because of the gerrymandering, as there are Democratic safe seats as well. So it's no real shock that these election deniers won, but in many cases, they won primaries against pretty solid opponents, in many cases, incumbent opponents. So, this hasn't gone away. And as you say, they might be so outrageous in their governing that it would take a big rig in 2024. But as you say, it might be possible that it would take only a very small rig, or maybe no rig at all, which is, it's hard to contemplate at this point, but it's that it can be that close. So it's really hard at this point to say, definitively, this is the scenario for 2024. We don't know. We just know some of the forces in play and some of the aspects of it. And there's plenty of reason for one reason or another to be concerned and to definitely not go with this big hue that we're out of the woods and we're, a functioning democracy and everything's cool. Yeah, we did survive 2022. There wasn't a real focused effort to overthrow democracy in 2022. We'll see what happens in 2 years because those forces are still out there.
All right, I got 2 more questions for you, and then we'll wrap this up. Hopefully, by
Okay.
One question is, you said about DeSantis, and my understanding was there were federal observers that were sent down to Florida and they were turned away by DeSantis. Did you hear anything about that?
Only what you heard, that there were observers sent down. There were international observers, I believe, and then there were DOJ observers, right? Or some from the federal government.
Yeah.
And and they were actually literally kicked out of the precincts. It doesn't really surprise me. What we're going to have to do, I mean, we're not going to be able to go to Florida and say, here we're here to investigate the machines, a la Stop the Steal. But we can look at, there may be some FOIA requests that are made, but we certainly can look at some of the patterns and some of the subtler patterns that are indicative of manipulation. It wouldn't shock me if there was manipulation. However, we're not going to prove it. I can guarantee you that we're not going to be able to prove it. We'll just be able to look at it and say, okay, we have an eye on this.
Well,
And
hang on, but I mean, I think it's not was not a big deal. To me, it's a big deal. We sent the DOJ was like, hey, we're gonna totally back down and pee ourselves because we're not gonna mess with DeSantis, apparently.
yeah, no, I mean, that was that at the time it happened. I mean, there were so many things going on. It did get kind of, shuffled over. But it's huge because, I mean, there's always the issue of elections, and of course the Moore v. Harper case, which we haven't even gotten into. The degree how the power over elections is parceled out in the Constitution, for better or for worse. I mean, it's kind of a mixed regime. The states have a lot of power, counties have a lot of power. Federal, oversight is often depicted by states that don't want to see it as intrusion. Certainly that was the case in the South with the Voting Rights Act and with attempts to enforce the Voting Rights Act, which is why there had to be federal clearance until the Shelby case came along, and the Supreme Court took that away and basically gave the states free rein to, these states that had been proven to be discriminatory Jim Crow states. I believe there were 9 of them, and they no longer had to get federal clearance when they changed their laws or procedures around elections, and they wasted no time in getting deep into voter suppression and restriction. So, there's been a long history around this. But yeah, I mean, the DOJ did seem to, fold its tents pretty quickly. Now, whether that was specific fear of DeSantis or whether it was a sense, again, of not wanting to undermine voter confidence in the electoral process, which if ever there was a double-edged sword, that's it. We don't, I don't have inside sources in the DOJ, but yeah, that was a big problem. And does it mean DeSantis had something to hide? Maybe. We don't know.
Well, I mean, there's a list of everything DeSantis has done that he's just carving out his little fiefdom and saying democracy does not apply to Florida. I used to think Georgia was where democracy went to die, but DeSantis said, hold my beer,
Yeah, I mean, Georgia kind of got, Georgia's a fascinating case because, it really was. I mean, you look at the Ossoff Handel race for the the 6th congressional district back in 2017. Oh boy, and all the way back to Max Cleland, in 2002 and Saxby Chambliss. I mean, there have been some really notable anomalies in Georgia. I mean, things that just smell to high hell. And, when Donald Trump got on the phone with Raffensperger and, basically said, find me, it's not that hard, find me 11,700 votes, that in a way, it kind of, it sort of exposed them. And, they seem in certain respects to have been chastened. Not all, because they're still pushing a hell of a lot of voter suppression, and you still got the ballot marking devices, and Georgia may still be a place where democracy goes to die, but there's a lot more scrutiny on it, and they really had to be careful. And they took the stance of being fundamentally anti-Trump. We actually, maybe there was a little bit of genuine, love for democracy there.
No, there was no love for democracy. There was a we don't want this dictator. We want a dictator. We want a Republican dictator, but we don't want Trump.
Yeah, more likely than not, that was it. And Kemp has been dirty basically his whole career. Raffensperger, I don't know. I don't know what's driving him. But I would say that, Georgia, the results tend to indicate that there's some semblance of, enough scrutiny there to keep it from becoming a Florida-like route. On the other hand, Florida, which has not undergone the kind of demographic change that would explain the results of the 2022 election, seems to, as you say, be DeSantis's fiefdom. And you really got to worry. I mean, if that's a Democrat and it's Boss Tweet, or it's, Tammany Hall, or it's Chicago and Mayor Daley, or even Massachusetts for that matter, whenever one party and particularly one strongman, consolidates their rule, you got to start looking for fraud. I mean, you got to start looking for all these thumbs on the scale. And I think, so we're going to take a look at Florida. The wheels kind of grind slow and small, but the data is out there, and we're going to see what we can find. But yeah, DeSantis is scary. And, best case scenario from a progressive standpoint, I guess, is, and there are not too many great scenarios going forward, but, DeSantis and Trump carve each other up for breakfast. And Trump is the kind of guy that may actually go through with that, in spite of, every signal to him telling him to back off. We'll have to see. So that's what I'm saying. There's so many, variables about who the standard bearers are. Even with Biden, there's some, a little bit of reason to doubt. But certainly with Trump and DeSantis and the other Republicans, that it's really hard to get a definitive bead on 2024. It's just that, there are places like Florida that, could serve as a model for a lot more places, in terms of legislation passed, in terms of control of the process. And that really puts us right back in the, well, we've never gotten out of the soup. We're still in the soup. And, the dangerous thing out of 2022 is this, as I said, the big hue that everything is, is fine and our democracy is strong. That is certainly not the case.
Well, let me ask, first off, let me say, you can tell DeSantis is feeling himself because he challenged Disney's autonomy, which is no one challenges Disney's autonomy in Florida. So clearly he's feeling strong. But my last question, and just touching this briefly and hope we can talk again at length about this, because I think it's important, is more in the imperial state legislature and their unquestioned power to select electors. So just give me a couple minutes of what you think about that. And again, hopefully we can talk in depth about that subject because it's a long one.
Yeah, I mean, technically it's called the independent state legislature, but you know that, right? But why not? It's really the imperial state legislature. Well, I wrote a column on that recently for Who What Why. Try to dissect it from the standpoint of, reading the tea leaves and the oral arguments and the extent to which you might, you could trust, because again, there was a big hue, that Kavanaugh and Barrett and Roberts, seem to be opposed to a maximalist reading of the independent state legislature theory. And they, could be trusted about as far as we could trust them in their confirmation hearings. Roe v. Wade's a settled case. No, we won't disturb it. I have no plans along those lines. Well, it took them not very, very long to accept Dobbs and then make their ruling and overrule Roe v. Wade. So big grain of salt in terms of how we can read the oral hearings, which incidentally for Moore ran nearly 3 hours in length. By comparison, the Dobbs hearings ran 2 hours, under 2 hours. Huge critical case, and the average Supreme Court oral hearings run about an hour. So this was 3 times as long. Obviously a huge case, and basically what the proposition that it stands for is that to one extent or another, state legislatures are empowered by a clause in the really by 2 clauses in the Constitution to run the elections, set the time, place, manner of the elections, and the process of choosing elections for senators and representatives, and set the process for choosing electors for president as well. That's in Article 2, as opposed to Article 1, which is the legislative one for Congress. And so, the question is, how do you take this language And does it mean exclusive? And does it mean the governor has no role? And does it mean the courts, state courts have no role? And where that's important is that you have these MAGA state legislatures in about close to 30 states that are very extreme. Gerrymandering has a lot to do with that. Setting up all these safe seats where they don't have to compromise one bit. They can be as extreme as they want and get reelected. So we have these majorities that are prepared to create even more extreme gerrymandering maps and set up all sorts of rules for elections that discriminate. And over the past years, the state courts in many states, including Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, have been the brake, the emergency brake on these legislatures. And to some extent, the governors, Governor Evers in Wisconsin, Governor Cooper in North Carolina, Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania, have also vetoed some of this legislation. Well, under an interpretation of the independent legislature, state legislature theory that was being pushed at the Supreme Court by the North Carolina legislature and by amicus briefs from all these far right organizations, that basically there would be no governor's veto, there would be no review by the courts. The legislatures, by the U.S. Constitution, are invested with the sole authority and to make all these rules and potentially, and this was waved off by some commentators and flagged by other commentators, potentially to choose the electors, the slate of electors that got sent to Congress, so that in those cases where John Eastman wanted to go to those state legislatures in 2020 and say, yeah, Biden won the popular vote, we know that was a fraud, so just send a set of state of electors to Congress for Donald Trump, that failed in 2020, in large part because the courts were involved. But under an expansive reading of independent state legislature theory, that could very well succeed. And you could literally have a legal coup that changed the result of elections in all these swing states that happen to have powerful Republican legislatures, courtesy of gerrymandering. So that's why there was all this hand-wringing doesn't quite even do it justice, why there's all this alarm about the impact of this case, which in many ways, it's way less, sorry for the pun, but sexy than Dobbs. It's the kind of thing where the average voter, even, moderately informed voter, it's way, way inside baseball as far as their, knowledge of and understanding of this. It's very much a beltway and state house, and court kind of thing. But the implications are even greater and broader than, for instance, a Dobbs decision. And so it's something that the decision will come down probably not before June. And the sort of cant, the tilt of the oral arguments suggested that the court was not going to endorse this expansive maximalist reading of independent state legislature theory, which has always been a fringe theory at best. But again, how much can you really trust the signals being sent by folks like Kavanaugh and Barrett that in their confirmation hearings basically hid the ball completely? So we'll have to see and wait and see what comes out. And it could be a disaster. It could be less than a disaster. And let's hope for the best as far as that one goes.
I think the 3 hours is kind of window dressing. I feel like when democracy is ended in June, we'll be saying, well, at least they deliberated for 3 hours. At least it went the distance.
Oh, Doug, you're so cynical. I mean, I think they genuinely had stuff to deliberate about. And I don't think, frankly, I think you're wrong there, because I don't think they give a rat's ass about window dressing at this point. I do think they had genuine questions, but where I do agree with you is this, you know, the pointedness and the hostility of their questions to the petitioner, who was obviously in favor of this reading of the independent state legislature doctrine. Their questions seem to be hostile, but that's what I'm saying you got to really take with a grain of salt. When push comes to shove, we know the court, the ISL maximalist interpretation, has 3 votes guaranteed on the court. You've got Gorsuch, you've got Thomas, and you've got Alito. Roberts is unlikely, but Kavanaugh and Barrett are very, you know, Kavanaugh has expressed support for this reading as well. So really it comes down to Barrett.
Oh,
And,
good.
you know,
That's where I want to put my faith in.
yeah, I mean, really, I mean, you know, this is, and again, who is Barrett? Barrett is somebody who got rammed through in the last month of a presidency, you know, after Mitch McConnell said we can't have you know, a vote during the Obama presidency on Merrick Garland. So, I mean, Barrett comes with a, you know, with a double asterisk to the court to begin with. I mean, this whole thing has been, you know, a power play and just barely on the edge of legality from, you know, or constitutionality from the get-go. And they've got their supermajority, and damn it, they're going to use it. The question just becomes, you know, within the limits of good taste, or do we just go, you know, go to the wall and let the people eat cake?
Some form of the independent state legislature will pass, I think.
Yeah.
Whether it will
Yeah.
be the maximum, I don't know. I know Roberts will fight for a compromise where he
Right.
can save some fig leaf of democracy. I know that will be his goal. But
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're right about that. I mean, and you know, and again, the best, I would say the best we can reasonably hope for is pretty bad, but nowhere near as bad as if somehow they manage to get, you know, Kavanaugh and Barrett on board with a maximalist reading. And from that point forward, really, you know, I mean, on the one hand, it looks very technical. Well, you closed the state court door and you took the governor out of the process, but there's still the federal courts and there's blah, blah, blah. Well, out of that scenario, if that passes, there is such a huge, how should I put it? It invalidates basically 2 centuries of state law all over the country, and it invalidates potentially citizen initiatives to, for instance, you know, expand voting rights through state constitution initiatives, or to protect certain classes of voters through state constitution initiatives, or to re-enfranchise felons, or any of those things. I mean, those are, so what you have in the, if they put forward a maximalist ISL, in the best case scenario, you're likely to have electoral chaos as early as 2024. In the worst case scenario, you have a bunch of, you know, false electors, and you've got extreme gerrymandering, and you've got all sorts of provisions passed that cannot be reviewed under the state constitution. It could really get ugly. So let's hope that, you know, that isn't where it goes. But
well, I know what I'm betting on. Do you want to put $20 on it? Because I'll put $20 on the end of democracy right here, right now.
yeah, well, you know, I mean, part of it, I'll bet with you. We can do a $20
Yeah,
bet with that.
you come out ahead either way. Either, you know,
Yeah.
$20 and democracy exists.
But part of, you know, what we're touching on is really, here's part of it. When they move the goalpost, when they move the 50-yard line, is more, I guess, more apt, so far to the right that we go, oh, thank God, when they've only destroyed 75% of democracy, they win. And that's part of what this whole thing has been about from the days of Goldwater on, and through Reagan and through the Federalist Society, is let's just shift the whole damn debate, right? The whole damn debate over to the right. And then, you know, we're relieved. We're relieved when it's just DeSantis, not Trump, or, you know, just, you know, a bad ruling from the Supreme Court, not an absolutely horrific ruling. So, that's part of the game is you move the whole field, you move both sets of goalposts. And then we were very happy with really bad results because they're not absolutely cataclysmic results. And that sort of, in a way, I mean, both sides could sort of make that argument that both sides have done that in a way, and nobody's happy at this point, which is part of what's wrong with the country. Is that there's a feeling we really should be living in two separate countries. And it's not inconceivable that that will come about within our lifetimes.
Well, I think I mean, like you said, they win one way or another. They win. It's because they've got all the money, like in Meatballs. They have the billionaires, and the billionaires also have the Democratic Party leadership, at least. So,
Yeah, again, we sort of disagree about that, although obviously the Democratic Party.
Well, I don't think you disagree with the narrow plane. Do you not? That the let's say, how about not belong to that the leadership of the Democratic Party, the 5 or 6 top politicians, maybe the top 50, are heavily influenced by the donor class? I mean, is that a claim you actually reject?
Yeah, no, they're all heavily. I mean, they've made politics very expensive, and they need their money, and they like their money, and they're all very heavily influenced by the donor class. That's absolutely true. I mean, we're living kind of in a plutocracy, hybrid plutocracy, oligarchy, democracy. I'm not sure. I'm not an idealist. I've gotten too old. So, I kind of reject the idea that we can make everything just wonderful and kumbaya and the lion will lie down with the lamb. I mean, it's just a question of, the human species, how badly it basically mangles things. So, in certain ways, I'm satisfied with a system that at least, yeah, it's unjust and it's got all these flaws and everything, but, at least it's not outright crazy and we're not being sent to concentration camps. So maybe I've lowered my standards to a point that is already a defeat. I don't know. It's something I think about all the time is what really should we be expecting, what should we be standing for? And and right now in this country we've gotten to the point where a lot of progressives just feel like survival is good enough. And then I have friends, on the left who feel like the whole thing really needs to blow up. I mean, they're not far from Steve Bannon in terms of how they look at this whole, elitist driven, money driven system. So, it's grievous. I mean, this stuff really does keep me up at night. And I don't have an answer yet. And I'm not sure I ever will. And I'm not sure anybody will really care if I came up with a personal answer for me. I mean, it's something that, history will out and we'll see, what road this goes down. But right now, I mean, you can't blame people for being depressed. I mean, the rates of, adolescent suicide are way up. There's obviously a malaise. There's obviously a sense of, with all the wonder of technology and everything, there's something gone wrong. And again, that's somewhat in contrast, I ref soccer. And so I see all the time people doing sports, competing, basically having fun, doing things that are good. So I see, there's plenty of good out there, and there's plenty of decency out there, and there's plenty of peace out there. How many psychopaths does it take to screw up the whole world? It turns out not very many. You take Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and Donald Trump, and maybe throw in a Marjorie Taylor Greene, and it's enough to screw up at least a good part of the world. Other people would say, George Soros and Anthony Fauci or whatever. I'm not of that school. But
well, no, I mean, because you're saying, but I would say that in a meaningful way, the U.S. has only been a democracy from about 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act until 2002. And anything past 2002 and anything before 1965, you have a good argument that we didn't have a nationwide democracy.
I'd agree with you. I mean, we were born into that democracy. So, every signal was to take it for granted, just assume that it was a, birthright.
For 100 years, Jim Crow made the South nothing
Right.
like a democracy.
Right. And
And
Athens wasn't a democracy either. And there are very few, if any, real, how should I put it, genuine democracies or democratic republics that don't have all sorts of thumbs on the scale. And we've got plenty now. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say the golden age was all that golden. I mean, after 65, and you still had Nixon, you still had Ronald Reagan, you still had all sorts of
no, but you didn't
corruption.
have
But
half the country with that the elections were rigged in the sense that a significant minority slash majority couldn't vote, just couldn't
yeah,
vote. Jim
yeah,
Crow
no,
laws.
no, absolutely.
You couldn't
And
vote in the South.
no, things,
Not a single election. There was not for 100 years. You can't claim an election was legitimate from 1865 to 1965.
right. And before 1865, I mean, you had, senators selected by, I mean, I don't remember exactly when the amendment was passed, but I mean, all the way up to the 1900s, senators were selected by state legislatures, property qualifications for voting. Obviously, women couldn't vote. You had racial, bars on voting. I mean, yeah, it was basically a white male Christian patriarchy that called itself a democracy and took great pride in, in our Constitution and all that. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that obviously that you don't teach in school, and certainly if the right has its way, and in red states will never be taught in school. That cause you to look at that in a very, very, very different way. I mean, maybe we have an opportunity now. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in a way, things are more out in the open. You know, I just don't know. I mean, it's so, I know it hurts my brain because there's so many factors that I look at and elements that I look at, and I can't really do the full computation and say, okay, where's it going? I mean, we got our $20 bet. I don't think democracy is going to end in June. But it wouldn't totally surprise me if I had a fork over the 20. So, let's meet again when we, sometime before June, and see if maybe we want to double down on the bet. And then after June, and see who takes who to dinner.
Yeah, well, I think now it's interesting. I mean, before it's just democracy. Now there's $20 on the line. So
Yeah, which
now,
is important. That's important. Yeah, especially given what we get paid, that really is important. So, yeah, well, I thank you for it, having me on and asking me all these really, really stimulating questions. I mean, they are just, I think, anybody, it's easy not to be interested in this stuff because it's so overwhelming that it's, it almost drives you back to just paying. And, you may have life circumstances that are just so demanding. But if you have any brain space at all, I mean, these are the things where we really need to have thought. We need to have dialogue. We need to come to some sort of, consensus ultimately about where we're going with all this stuff. And, that only happens with effort. It doesn't grow on trees.
well, I don't think there's a political solution. I think that I guess what I say about democracy is how much were you sort of ruled by the people, by the many, as opposed to sort of your neighbors. And I think the US did better than a lot of monarchies and other dictatorships, in the 1800s and 1900s. But we're trying to govern a first century country with a 19th century or an 18th century document.
Yep.
The Constitution can't adapt. And there's been better constitutions written by like France and Germany and countries that have written their constitution in the 20th century. And they're like, this is, you can't have a 3-month delay because you're not waiting for someone to become president to ride by horseback to Washington, D.C. from across the country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the interesting, when you think about writing a new constitution, I mean, I don't know if you've read John Rawls, Theory of Justice, and boy, it's a heavy piece of writing, a heavy book. But, if you think about MAGAs and progressives, Americans on the red and the blue coming together to write a constitution, and how difficult a task that would be to come out with something that doesn't merely put forward provisions and processes to gain partisan advantage. How difficult it would be to really write a new constitution, I think, is one reason why there's such a consensus to just, hey, let's stick with what we've got. Let's tweak it a little. Let's nibble at the edges. Let's have a few, stretched interpretations. But God help us if we actually had to write a new one. And I think if we had to write a new one, it might become apparent that we really can't co-function, red and blue America, rural and urban America. I don't know. Or we'd all need at least some sort of mass therapy session to learn, how to find that common ground. I had an idea for that. It kind of was trying to develop with Celeste Headley, who is, an NPR person, about, called Our Common Divide. And, to try to bring people together, almost like a dating service for not actual romantic dating, but pairing service for political opposites. And we kind of let it languish, in part because it seemed so progressively more impossible as the Trump administration went on. But, it might be something that one of these billionaires, they got a lot of money to put into things, maybe they want to give it a whirl. And set something up and see if we can start talking to one another. I don't know if it's possible. Maybe on a one-to-one basis it is, and you get away from the demagoguery and you get away from all the nonsense on on the social media and whatnot. When people are face to face, even over Zoom, or Skype or something, there tends to be more willingness to listen and respect. So maybe there is a future in that.
Well, that's hopeful. I guess we'll end on that because I don't feel a need. But I mean, something about a billionaire trying to make things more democratic.
Yeah, I mean, they'd probably find a way to ruin it, but but you never know. And inspired.
Talk about Rawls. I mean, Rawls. We talked about Rawls before, and the idea that for anyone who doesn't know Rawls, that if you sort of before you were born, and you had a separate system where you didn't know if you were going to be born into a rich family or a poor family or into aristocracy or not, how would you set up the rules of society, not knowing beforehand what your place would be, and you think that would be you'd make it as fair as possible,
Right.
rather than sort of setting up a lotto and you just hope you get a winning hand.
Yeah, and there's the principle, the guiding principle is the thing he called maximizing, which is to say, you try to set the bottom where you could wind up at the lowest you could end up as being at least tolerable. And that's basically a prescription for the welfare state, which is the way most democracies have gone, is that, you take the people who have the bad luck, and you make life decent and bearable and, productive for them. And, we, to some extent we do that, but we don't do that to the extent that, as you said, these other countries that have had our experience, for one thing, to build on, have built into their constitutions and into their political systems. So, we could use a little of that, but it's an almost impossible thought experiment to lay aside what you actually are and what your possessions and your interests and your aspirations actually are, for some abstract consideration such as Rawls was proposing. I think that was one of the takeaways I had from his book many years ago, which was that in a sense he was writing to prescribe a way of going about things, but also to show why it was so incredibly difficult to achieve justice and to achieve that kind of fairness, in practice. So we'll see.
I'm sure, he was arguing for a better society, but based on hypothetical conditions. But I think I told you when I lost all faith in Rawls.
I remember.
I'll just recap it. Sorry, I was doing stand-up comedy at an open mic, and a very, I think, Rawlsian situation came up where they said, look, there's like 30 of you, we only have an hour or whatever time we had. So we can either give 3 minutes to what you usually do, and about half of you are not gonna be able to go up, or everybody can go up, but you only do 2 minutes.
Right.
And granted, this is in Los Angeles, this is in Burbank, and this is 11 p.m. amongst stand-up comics. But yeah, a situation where it could be everybody would get something, and it'd be fair for everybody, and you had no way of knowing whether how you would do in a lottery because it'd be random names being picked.
Right.
So everybody's in the same situation,
And
you can have
they rejected the fair
by
approach.
a landslide. It was me voting for 2 minutes, and that was it.
Yeah.
And everybody else.
But
And I was
that's exactly my point about Rawls, is that, you know, and that's without even knowing on their part how they were going to fare in this lottery, right?
Right. That's what makes it
Who's gonna get
wrong.
excluded. That's
You
without
have no
even
way of
knowing.
Yeah,
Without
yeah,
even knowing who's going to get
yeah.
excluded. But if you told them, you, and let's say there were 30 people there, and you told 20 of them, hey, you're going to get 3 minutes, and you told 10 of them under the non-lottery, you know, under the lottery system, you're going to get 3 minutes, and you told 10 of them you're going to get shut out. Let's have a vote. Do we want to embrace this the fairness proposal? Well, do you think any of those 20 would vote to embrace the fairness proposal? No, they know they're going to get their 3 minutes. And that's the problem we have now. People have their money and they damn well want to keep it. And they have the control of the levers of power and they damn well want to keep it. So how would we go about, you know, or they got their religion and they've got their, you know, abortion laws and they got their whatever. How do you go about setting up a system that would take that away from them when they know that it would take it away from them? And that was when I lost faith in Rawls, you know, without having the concrete experience you had, was just abstractly to look at it and say, well, who the hell is ever going to go for this, you know, outside the classroom? So.
No, absolutely not. But you know, I think it's, you know, if you can't have a revolution because that's illegal, you can have a general strike, a peaceful general strike, and you know, look how badly COVID spooked the donor class when people stopped working because they had to, or at least because they wanted to, because they didn't want to die. And the speed that COVID was declared over by both sides, Biden and Trump, despite it, you know, claiming 1 million lives and people still dying over 1,000 a week. We're told
even in China, where the government controls everything, you know, even there, these forces are really strong. You know,
so I mean, I'm just saying that the value, the power of non-participation is huge.
Oh, you know, we've talked about this. I know we've talked about this in the past. We've talked about, you know, with our, you know, great planning abilities and organizational networks. Sarcasm.
It can't be done. It can't be done. Sorry, that's all right. It requires a huge amount of togetherness and networking. The way but like how long it took to get Starbucks to the point where they could do a 3-day strike.
I know.
Have unions whatsoever. It would take years and years, but nonetheless, I don't see any other alternative to balance out the scales.
Well, and as we said, I mean, if you think about as consumers, how much of our spending is purely discretionary. I mean, you know, obviously there are people who have to spend everything they've got just to get baby milk and, you know, survive and pay the rent. And, you know, even then they don't have enough. But there's a huge, still, with all the decimation of the middle class, there's a huge, you know, pool of consumers out there who could just freaking stop buying crap like the latest smartphone and the latest, you know, 78-inch flat screen TV and the latest air fryer and whatever, and then the latest Tesla. I mean, they could just say no to buying until XYZ were instituted into our, you know, culture, into our constitution, into our elections, whatever. It is a tremendous power. I could not agree with you more. But very, very, very difficult to mobilize unless you're a serious influencer. And even for serious influencers, a few of them would have to get together to push something like this. There'd be a lot of pushback against it as well. But I mean, I do see that as, you know, if things got bad enough, if you get pushed far enough, And that's part of the game, is to push you just far, just so far, but not to the point where you storm the Bastille. And I'm not at the point of storming the Bastille. I imagine a lot of people like me are not. And we want to hold on to what we have. It's vaguely criminal, but we haven't been pushed quite to that point yet. And we'll see if that's what happens going forward. And if, when it does happen, we're in a country like China where it's almost impossible to revolt because they have control of and surveillance of absolutely everything. And that's really the most frightening prospect to me.
All right, we wrapped up, and I said I was at other questions, but talk about China and monitoring and infringement, not being able to communicate. Any thoughts on Twitter? Like within a minute or two, like very brief thought on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal feed seemed to have gotten, the notifications feed seemed to have gotten warped and decimated, and I'm not hearing from any of my correspondents and followers, and I don't know if that's because they've dropped off or because the algorithm's been tweaked. I mean, I do not like what Musk is obviously saying. I don't like what he's doing. I think the whole thing, he just ran a poll that said, should I step down? And apparently the answer is resoundingly yes. I doubt he will take that advice, but you never know with him. I don't know, we needed another sort of proto-fascist psychopath like a hole in the head. I spent a fair amount of energy building up a following on Twitter. Jenny Cohn built up a following that was like 25 times the size of mine, without being a famous person, without a blue check, just by presenting really compelling material. You hate to see all that shot to hell and wasted. You hate to see it become, a playground for hate speech. I don't know. I haven't given it enough thought to really have an action plan. It just, it's another, and the hits keep on coming, kind of thing. And have to figure out, where it goes and where to go from here. A lot of uncertainty.
Well,
I thought Twitter was fine. I know that it wasn't perfect in regulating, and it's always a very, very difficult thing to figure out where to draw the line on free expression versus hate speech versus violence, instigation and all that. Is very, very difficult to make those decisions, even about a single thing like a book or something, let alone about a constant stream of millions and millions and billions of messages, a day or a month or whatever. I just, I thought it ran reasonably well. I know there was a lot of crap before Musk. I didn't experience much of it. I experienced really intelligent and thoughtful, for the most part, 99% dialogue with colleagues and people that I agreed with or disagreed with, but were respectful and interesting and brought up interesting points. I thought it was a very, very fine forum for that kind of dialogue, at least my neck of the Twitter woods. So this whole thing has just been, it's been gross and unwelcome. And I don't know. I hope Musk gives it up. And I would not buy a Tesla if I had all the money in the world, and I'd find some other electric vehicle. I don't like the way he runs his businesses. I don't like really, at this point, anything about him, and I wouldn't trust him with a space program. And I just, if it's possible, I just hope he would go away.
Well, I really liked what Twitter was, and I am very disappointed to see it being gutted like this. But thank you for giving your time. I really appreciate it. I'll put up on YouTube the entire interview, and if you have, once you get a chance to kind of go through it, any sections you want me to pull out for separate, shorter videos, I will. So thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Doug. This was very stimulating, and I've been tired lately and everything. You got me to wake up. It's very, good questions and good talking with you.
Well, I made a bet with you that I'm hoping I do.
All right, that bet's on. We can sweeten the pot at any time. Let's hope
All
for the
right.
best in June. All right, take care, Doug. Talk to you
Thanks.
soon. All right, bye.